The monsoon rain hammered down so hard that Private Paul Large couldn't see more than 20 meters into the rubber plantation. August 18, 1966, 4:08 p.m. Long Tan, Phuoc Tuy Province. The 19-year-old conscript from Sydney counted his remaining magazines. 3 left. Around him, the men of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, were rationing their ammunition, firing disciplined bursts at an enemy they could barely see through the curtains of tropical rain. Large pressed himself into the mud behind a rubber tree as another wave of Viet Cong fighters surged forward. The distinctive crack of AK-47s punctured the roar of the downpour. Somewhere to his left, Lieutenant Jeff Kendall was shouting fire orders, his voice nearly drowned by the artillery impacts that had become their lifeline. Large checked his watch again. They'd been in contact for over 2 hours. Intelligence had said maybe a company of VC in the area, perhaps 120 men. The math wasn't adding up. The volume of fire, the coordinated assault waves, the discipline of the enemy movements. This wasn't a company. This was a regiment. Maybe 2. Conserve your ammo. The order passed down the line. Large did the calculation every soldier dreads. 3 magazines, 20 rounds per magazine. 60 rounds between him and a bayonet charge against an enemy that seemed endless. He glanced at the young bloke next to him, saw the same cold realization in his eyes. D Company had walked into something far bigger than anyone had imagined. And now, 108 men stood between a regimental-sized Viet Cong force and the main Australian base 3 kilometers away at Nui Dat. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Australian forces had come to Vietnam precisely to avoid the American mistakes, to show how proper counterinsurgency worked. Now they were fighting World War II-style defensive action in a rubber plantation, outnumbered at least 20-1, running out of bullets. When the 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat in June 1966, American commanders watched with polite skepticism. Here came the Australians, the British Commonwealth's contribution to the war effort, setting up their neat perimeter with its textbook defensive positions, talking about hearts and minds and proper infantry tactics. The Americans had already learned the hard truth about Vietnam. This wasn't the kind of war you won by digging in and patrolling. This was search and destroy country, body count territory, helicopter war. The Australians are applying Korean War tactics to a Vietnam War problem, one Macy V staff officer observed dismissively in July 1966. The 1st ATF's commander, Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, didn't particularly care what the Americans thought. Jackson, a veteran of the Kokoda track campaign in New Guinea and Korea, believed the Americans were doing it wrong. You don't fight insurgency with B-52 strikes and free fire zones, he told his battalion commanders. You fight it with disciplined infantry, good intelligence, and winning the population. The men of 6 RAR shared their commander's confidence. These weren't green conscripts. The battalion had a solid core of national servicemen mixed with professional soldiers, many with Malayan emergency experience. They'd trained hard at Holsworthy and Canungra, learned jungle warfare from men who'd fought communist insurgents before. They understood fire discipline, tactical patience, the importance of not wasting ammunition on shadows. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, commanding 6 RAR, emphasized marksmanship over volume of fire. Every round counts, he hammered into his men. The SLR gives you range and accuracy the Americans' M16 can't match. Use it properly. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian version of the Belgian FNFAL, fired 7.62 mm NATO rounds, heavier, more powerful than the American 5.56 mm, good for 600 meters with iron sights and trained hands. In August 1966, that training seemed like overkill. The 1st ATF's area of operations, Phuoc Tuy Province, had Viet Cong activity, certainly, but nothing suggesting major formations. Intelligence estimates put enemy strength at company-level units, 100-150 fighters, engaging in typical guerrilla harassment. The big units, the NVA regulars and main force VC battalions, were supposedly up north near the DMZ or in the Central Highlands. The Australians settled into their routine: aggressive patrolling, civic action programs, building relationships with local villages. By mid-August, they'd had minor contacts, a few firefights, nothing serious. Task Force intelligence assessed the area as moderate threat, small unit actions likely. Perfect for demonstrating superior Commonwealth infantry tactics. The Viet Cong had other plans. The Battle of Long Tan didn't start on August 18th. It started 2 nights earlier when 275th Viet Cong Regiment mortarmen crept within range of the Australian base at Nui Dat. At 2:30 a.m. on August 17th, more than 100 mortar rounds slammed into the sleeping Australian position, killing 1 soldier and wounding 23 others. It was the opening move in what VC commanders intended as a decisive blow: a coordinated multi-battalion assault on the Australian base itself. What Brigadier Jackson and his intelligence officers didn't know was that 3 Viet Cong main force units had concentrated in Phuoc Toi province specifically to destroy the Australian presence. The 275th Regiment, the D4-5 Battalion, and elements of the 5th VC Division, combined strength, approximately 2,500 fighters, well armed with AK-47s, RPD machine guns, 60mm and 82mm mortars, and RPG-2 rocket launchers. They'd been staging in the dense jungle east of Nui Dat, preparing for a set-piece attack to overrun the base and humiliate Australia's intervention in the war. The morning of August 18th, Task Force intelligence picked up signs of enemy movement. Townsend ordered B Company out on a patrol sweep to find the mortar positions and track the enemy. By midday, B Company had located evidence of a major VC base camp, but hadn't made contact. At 3:00 p.m., Townsend committed D Company, commanded by Major Harry Smith, to continue the hunt. Major Smith, 33 years old, Korean war veteran, led 108 men into the rubber plantation east of Nui Dat. D Company consisted of 3 rifle platoons, 10 platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall, 11 platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Dave Sabin, and 12 platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, plus company headquarters. They carried standard combat loads, pouches filled with SLR magazines, grenades, smoke, water. Artillery support was on call from the 105mm guns of New Zealand's 161 Battery, 1st Field Regiment RNZA, positioned at Nui Dat. Smith wasn't expecting much. The intelligence brief suggested they were chasing a withdrawing enemy force, maybe a company at most. Standard sweep and search operation. They'd be back for dinner. At 3:40 p.m., 11 platoon made contact. The 1st VC appeared like ghosts materializing from the rubber trees. 2nd Lieutenant Dave Sabin's 11 platoon was on point when they spotted a small group of enemy soldiers about 150 meters ahead. Sabin ordered his lead section to engage. The VC scattered, and 11 platoon pressed forward in pursuit. Classic contact drill, exactly as trained. Then the jungle exploded. It was like someone flipped a switch, Private Bob Buick recalled. 1 second we're chasing maybe 10 VC, the next second we're taking fire from 3 sides. Heavy fire. I mean really heavy. The VC hadn't scattered. They'd baited the trap. 11 platoon had walked straight into the killing zone of a prepared ambush executed by D45 Battalion, approximately 600 strong. Major Smith, 200 meters behind with Company HQ, immediately grasped the tactical reality. This wasn't a chance contact with a retreating unit. The volume and discipline of enemy fire indicated a major formation. He ordered 10 and 12 platoons to move up in support while radioing Battalion HQ for immediate artillery support. 11 platoon, pinned down and taking casualties, desperately needed help. By 4 p.m., all 3 platoons were engaged. Smith deployed them in a rough arrowhead formation, 11 platoon in the center with 10 platoon on the left and 12 platoon on the right. The rubber plantation, with its orderly rows of trees and relatively open understory, provided some fields of fire, but precious little cover. The Australians went to ground, using the rubber trees and small folds in the earth as their only protection. Then, the monsoon hit. Tropical rain poured down with apocalyptic intensity, reducing visibility to meters, turning the red clay soil into slick mud, drowning out verbal commands. And through that curtain of water, the Viet Cong launched their first major assault. They came in waves, Corporal Jack Kirby remembered. Disciplined, coordinated. These weren't guerrillas. These were trained soldiers executing fire and movement tactics. We could hear whistles and bugles directing them through the rain. The 275th Regiment had joined the battle, coordinating with D445 Battalion for a classic double envelopment, attempting to encircle D Company completely. The Australians fired back with brutal efficiency. The SLR's 7.62mm rounds punched through the rain with lethal accuracy. Corporal Kirby, manning the company HQ's M60 machine gun, laid down interlocking fields of fire with the 2 M60s in 11 platoon. Sergeant Bob Buick directed his section's fire with parade ground precision. Aimed shots, pick your targets, don't waste rounds. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every VC that fell, 2 more appeared. The Australian position began taking casualties. Private Jim Richmond was hit in the chest, killed instantly. Private John Martin, machine gunner in 11 platoon, took a round through the shoulder but kept his M60 firing. Lieutenant Kendall, directing 10 platoon's defense, was struck by shrapnel from an RPG but refused evacuation. At 4:15 p.m., Major Smith called for artillery support. Captain Maurice Stanley, the forward observer with D Company, began directing the New Zealand gunners with desperate precision. "Shot over," Stanley reported as the first 105mm rounds screamed overhead. "Shot at." 3 seconds later, the shells impacted 200 meters forward of the Australian position, erupting in geysers of mud and shrapnel among the advancing VC. The artillery saved them. Stanley walked the fire in a box pattern around D Company, creating a steel curtain that disrupted VC assault waves. "Bring it in closer," Smith ordered. "Danger close." Stanley complied, directing fire within 100 meters of friendly positions. Shells impacted so near that Australian soldiers felt the overpressure and caught shrapnel fragments. But it worked. The VC advance faltered. By 4:45 p.m., the ammunition situation became critical. Soldiers were down to their last magazines. "I had 15 rounds left," Private Large recalled. 15. The sergeant was going around collecting grenades from the dead and wounded to redistribute them. "We knew if they came again before the resupply got through, we'd be fighting with bayonets." The VC launched their most determined assault yet at 5 p.m. Elements of the 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion, numbering perhaps 800 fighters, pushed forward simultaneously from 3 directions. The Australians met them with everything they had left. Soldiers fired single shots, making every bullet count. The M60 gunners rationed bursts, 3-round controlled hammers instead of sustained fire. Officers and NCOs fought with their pistols, and still the enemy came. I saw VC soldiers climbing over their own dead to get at us. Sergeant Bill Akell remembered. The discipline was incredible. They maintained fire and movement under those artillery strikes. These were good soldiers. Really good. At the critical moment, Major Smith made a desperate request. Could the artillery fire airbursts, shells set to explode above ground, showering shrapnel down on the enemy? It was a dangerous ask in these conditions, with friendly forces so close, but Captain Stanley agreed. The New Zealand gunners switched to VT-fused rounds. The shells exploded in the air over the charging VC, scything through the assault wave with devastating effect. The VC attack broke. As the battle entered its third hour, both sides adapted to the brutal reality of close-quarters combat in a monsoon. The Viet Cong commanders, realizing the frontal assaults were bleeding their units dry against the Australian artillery, shifted to infiltration tactics. Small teams of 5 to 10 soldiers attempted to work around the flanks, looking for gaps to exploit. VC mortars, which had remained silent to avoid giving away their positions, now opened fire, dropping 60mm and 82mm rounds into the Australian position. Major Smith countered by contracting his perimeter, pulling the platoons into tighter mutual support. He positioned Company HQ in the center, creating an all-around defense that left no exposed flanks. The machine guns, repositioned constantly to meet new threats, became the backbone of the defense. Every time a VC probe found a weak point, an M60 would shift to hammer it closed. The radio became D Company's lifeline. Smith maintained constant communication with battalion headquarters, providing sit-reps and calling for support. His radio operator, Private Peter Ainsley, stayed glued to the set despite the incoming fire, managing multiple frequencies: battalion command net, artillery net, air support net. At 5:30 p.m., salvation appeared in the form of 9 RAAF UH-1 Iroquois helicopters. Hueys, the ubiquitous workhorses of the Vietnam War, piloted by numbers 9 Squadron RAAF crews who'd been scrambled from Vung Tau. They carried 3,000 rounds of 7.62-meter ammunition, boxes of M60 belts, grenades, and smoke, enough to keep D Company fighting. But landing in a hot LZ during a monsoon, under fire, required either extraordinary skill or complete insanity. The RAAF pilots chose skill. Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley brought his Huey in low and fast, skimming over the rubber trees while door gunners hosed down the tree line with M60 fire. The helicopters landed one at a time in a small clearing 100 meters behind the Australian position, offloading ammunition while ground crew and walking wounded manhandled the boxes forward through the mud and incoming fire. Those pilots were magnificent, Major Smith said later. They landed in conditions where visibility was almost zero, taking fire from multiple directions, and they stayed calm and professional. Without that resupply, we would have been finished. The ammunition resupply changed everything. Suddenly, soldiers had full pouches again, machine gunners had belt after belt of linked ammunition, platoon sergeants could distribute grenades properly. The psychological impact was immense. The desperate rationing mentality evaporated, replaced by renewed confidence. The Viet Cong, watching the helicopters land, realized their opportunity was slipping away. If the Australians could receive reinforcements by air, the tactical balance would shift decisively. VC commanders launched what they intended as the final, crushing assault at 6 p.m. This attack came from all sides simultaneously. A desperate, all-out push to overrun the Australian position before reinforcements arrived. An estimated 600 to 800 VC fighters surged forward through the rubber plantation, bugles blaring, officers shouting encouragement, soldiers advancing through their own artillery's mortar fire. The Australians met them with the disciplined violence of professional infantry. Full magazines now. The SLRs spoke in a coordinated symphony of semi-automatic fire. The M60s hammered without pause, gunners changing barrels as they glowed red-hot. The New Zealand artillery dropped a curtain of steel, firing at cyclic rate. 3 rounds per gun per minute, 8 guns firing, 24 shells every minute screaming down into the enemy ranks. And still the VC came on. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted on 11 platoons front, where several VC penetrated the line. Bayonets flashed. Private Bob Gibson killed 2 VC with his rifle butt after his weapon jammed. Sergeant Jack Kirby emptied his 9mm pistol into a VC soldier who'd reached company HQ. For 10 minutes, the battle hung in absolute balance. Then the VC assault momentum broke. The combination of sustained small arms fire, devastating artillery, and the Australians' refusal to yield ground shattered the coordinated attack into isolated groups. The VC began falling back. At 6:45 p.m., the cavalry arrived. Literally. A company and B Company, 6 RAR, mounted in M113 armored personnel carriers, crashed through the rubber plantation from Nui Dat. The tracks, 11 vehicles loaded with fresh infantry, smashed into the VC's rear elements, machine guns blazing. The psychological impact of the APCs, buttoned up, unstoppable, their 50 caliber and 30 caliber guns raking the tree line, was devastating. The Viet Cong broke contact and withdrew. As darkness fell and the monsoon finally eased, Major Smith took stock. His company had fought for over 3 hours against an enemy force more than 20 times their strength. The ground around D Company's position bore testament to the battle's intensity. Bodies everywhere, shell craters, shredded rubber trees, the earth churned to red mud and blood. Australian casualties: 17 dead, 25 wounded. 1 additional soldier would die the next day from his wounds, against a force of 2,500. The true scope of the Viet Cong defeat became apparent the following morning. As 6 RAR troops swept the battlefield, they found carnage on a scale rarely seen in Vietnam. Official body count: 245 confirmed VC dead found on the battlefield. But the blood trails, abandoned equipment, and hasty graves suggested the actual casualties were far higher. Australian intelligence later estimated VC losses at 500 then 600 killed and wounded, nearly a quarter of their entire force. One captured VC soldier, wounded and left behind, told interrogators, "We were told the Australians were weak, that they would break easily. We were told wrong." The Viet Cong units that attacked Long Ton were effectively destroyed as combat formations. The 275th Regiment, D445 Battalion, and supporting elements needed months to reconstitute. And they never again attempted a major attack on the Australian task force. The planned assault on Nui Dat was abandoned. The VC High Command's assessment was stark. Australian infantry defensive tactics proved superior to anticipated. Frontal assault methodology ineffective against this opponent. Captain Harry Smith was awarded the Military Cross for his leadership during the battle. 4 other members of D Company received decorations for gallantry. The New Zealand gunners of 161 Battery, who fired over 3,000 rounds during the battle, more artillery support than many American divisions received in entire operations, earned a U.S. Presidential Unit citation. But the numbers don't capture what Long Ton demonstrated. Major Smith's tactics showcased the effectiveness of disciplined infantry fighting. Fire control, mutual support, coordinated defense, aggressive use of artillery. Every principle of infantry warfare executed under the worst possible conditions against overwhelming odds. The M60 machine guns, often criticized as temperamental, had performed magnificently. The 3 M60s with D Company fired an estimated 10,000 rounds during the battle and kept functioning despite the mud, rain, and constant use. The SLR proved its worth. Longer range and greater stopping power than the M16, giving Australian soldiers the ability to engage VC at distances where American weapons would have been less effective. Perhaps most importantly, Long Ton validated the Australian approach to Vietnam. Where American search and destroy operations emphasized mobility and firepower, accepting heavy casualties to achieve body counts, the Australians demonstrated that disciplined defensive tactics and superior training could achieve decisive results even when outnumbered. They'd held their ground, rationed their ammunition, used their artillery intelligently, and refused to panic. Long Tan became the defining battle of Australia's Vietnam War, the moment that validated every training exercise, every emphasis on marksmanship, every lecture on fire discipline. The battle proved that well-trained infantry, properly supported by artillery and air assets, could achieve tactical dominance even against overwhelming numbers. The American military took notice. While they didn't abandon search and destroy operations, some units began incorporating Australian tactical principles: tighter fire discipline, better use of supporting arms, emphasis on defensive positions. Senior MACV officers visited Nui Dat to study Australian methods. For the Viet Cong, Long Tan was a harsh lesson in the dangers of underestimating an enemy. The VC High Command had dismissed the Australians as token forces, light infantry that would crumble under pressure. Instead, they encountered soldiers who fought with the discipline of professional warriors and the ferocity of men who refused to yield. Subsequent VC operations in Phuoc Tuy province became more cautious, avoiding direct confrontation with Australian forces. The men of D Company returned to Nui Dat that night, physically and mentally exhausted, their uniforms filthy with mud and blood, their weapons empty, their ears ringing from hours of gunfire. Private Paul Large, who began the battle with 3 magazines and ended it firing borrowed rounds from the resupply, sat in the rain outside his tent and let the enormity of what they'd survived sink in. 108 men, 3 hours, 2,500 enemy, and they'd won. Major Harry Smith never claimed Long Tan as a great victory. "We did our job," he said years later. "That's all. We were trained soldiers who executed our training under difficult circumstances. The real heroes were the blokes who died doing it." On August 18th each year, Australian and New Zealand veterans gather to remember Long Tan. They remember the monsoon rain, the rubber plantation, the seemingly endless waves of enemy soldiers. They remember the courage it took to stand and fight when everything said to run. And they remember the fundamental lesson that afternoon in 1966 taught the world: that sometimes the greatest victories come from simply refusing to break. In the end, Long Tan became shorthand for the Australian Vietnam experience. Outnumbered, under-resourced, but never outfought.